Well, welcome everybody to tonight's financial aid webinar. My name is John Akins, and I'm one of the counselors here at Matamidi High School. And we're here along with my wonderful co-worker, Mr. Keith Miley, and our main presenter, who I'll introduce here shortly. But just want to take this time to, again, thank you all for joining us tonight. And a couple reminders. As we start the webinar, you'll see a Q&A button at the top of your screen. If you have any questions, please type them into the bar, and at appropriate times during the presentation, we'll get those questions answered for you. At this time, I'd like to introduce Mr. Jeff Olson. Jeff is the Director of Financial Aid at Bethel University. He's been coming out to Matamidi High School to do this presentation for many years now. I can't thank him enough for taking the time to come out. And Jeff, I can't believe it, you've been at Bethel for 22 years. So Jeff Olson, thanks so much.
I think I'm unmuted now. John, do you want to talk a little bit about the scholarship opportunities available, and then I'll get into the rest of the presentation? John, do you want to unmute and tell the rest of us?
Thank you. As a counselor here at Matamidi High School, we work a lot with the students working with financial aid and just teaching them a little bit about financial aid and the scholarship process. So one of the things that I wanted to cover before we get started here with Jeff tonight are just some of the scholarship opportunities and where families can find scholarship opportunities. So the screen that you're looking at right now, one of the best sources of financial aid information that I've ever found is directly through the Minnesota Office of Higher Education. And I always like to tell students that the more scholarships you apply for, the greater the opportunity of you getting one or two, maybe even more scholarships. But you have to at least apply to get those scholarships in most cases. So the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, if students start filling those scholarship applications out and at least starting a search, they will never run out of scholarships to apply for. And it's not just seniors, students in the younger grade levels as well can start looking for those scholarships. The second link that you see there, the second and third links are your Scholarship America and FastWeb. They can both be found on the Minnesota Office of Higher Education, but I wanted to point these two out as well. Scholarship America has all kinds of great scholarships for students to apply for. A lot of them are locally based as well. One of those scholarships that you'll find on Scholarship America is called the Tozer Foundation Scholarship, T-O-Z-E-R. You can actually just Google Tozer Foundation as well. The Tozer Foundation is an example of a scholarship that's open right now for students in Pine County, Washington County, and Kanabec County. And it's actually a scholarship that's worth up to $10,000 over 4 years. And it can be found right on Scholarship America or by going right to tozerfoundation.com. There's also all kinds of other scholarships on Scholarship America. It's just a great site to use to look for scholarships. Another one that we encourage students to use is called FastWeb. And this is one where I mentioned students will never run out of scholarships. In my opinion, it's true. If your son or daughter fills out the information on FastWeb, they will never run out of scholarships to apply for. And like I mentioned earlier, you never know. If you fill out enough, you might get one or two or more. Matamidi Area Education Foundation, the MAIF website, it's maifgives.org, maifgives.org. Scholarships right now for seniors are up and running. They are due on February 22nd. So students can go right to the Matamidi Area Education Foundation page and they can start applying for the local scholarships. There is one scholarship called the Stan and Doris Hill Outreach Scholarship that is available for students in the junior year of high school. Again, the scholarships through May are due. I believe I believe it's in March. I think it's March 15th, but they are open right now for students to apply for. The last one here is called Raise Me, and the website is raise.me. Raise Me is a way for students to fill out an account, set it up, and start putting in all of their different experiences and accomplishments as they go through high school. It's kind of like a bank account. You do one activity, you put that into your Raise Me account, and money can start to add up in that account. I always tell students, I go, you're crazy if you don't set up a Raise Me account, because there's a possibility that you could start earning some money in that account. Now, not every single college uses Raise Me, but you never know which colleges will, and a lot of them do, including the University of Minnesota. So Raise Me, check that one out, and you might find some really good information there for that your son or daughter can start to complete. Last thing I want to mention, we are recording this, so you will be able to go back and check out the information that is presented tonight. So with that, Jeff, I'll turn it back over to you.
All right, thanks very much. We're going to be talking about a number of different themes related to paying for college. And this is the agenda here. So you've got the cost of college, a little bit on investment, how will I pay for college, the different kinds of financial aid, how to apply, and then ideas for where you can look for additional information. On one of the last slides, I'll have my email address. And if you have a more personal question that you don't feel like you can answer in this kind of a setting, feel free to email me. What I would suggest is in the email, just identify, hi, this is who I am. I was at Matamidi. I won't try to recruit you to come to Bethel University. I'll just answer your question and do the best I can to help you understand the options available for you and your family. When we think about the cost of college, it's really important to recognize there are different kinds of colleges and universities. Oftentimes you hear things about a 4-year public or a 2-year public. You'll hear nonprofit or for-profit schools. Across the United States in 2015-16, there were over 4,500 different colleges or universities. In Minnesota, there were over 115 different colleges and universities. And these are examples in Minnesota. So a common 4-year public, University of Minnesota, Twin Cities, they've got over 34,000 undergraduate students in the fall of 18. Normandale Community College or University of St. Thomas would be an example of a 4-year nonprofit institution. Well, recognizing there are different kinds of colleges and universities, that also translates into the different systems. So in the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, for example, the University of Minnesota has 5 different campuses. And the prices may or may not be the same. The kind of financial aid may or may not be the same at each of those campuses. So when you're exploring the cost of college and type of aid available, make sure and probe and say, if I'm going to Twin Cities, is that going to be different than going to Duluth or going to Rochester? Within the Minnesota State Colleges and University systems, there are 7 state universities. That would include schools like Bemidji State or Metropolitan State. And then there are 30 state colleges, and the colleges tend to be the 2-year campuses. A community college, Century College would be an example of one of the Minnesota state colleges. When you think again of the Minnesota private not-for-profit colleges, there are 17 members of the Minnesota Private College Council. So you might hear information about the private colleges, and if that's coming from the Minnesota Private College Council, that's referring to this group of colleges listed here. But there are other private not-for-profit colleges in Minnesota that are not part of the council. An example would be Crown College or Dunwoody, Herzing, examples of other nonprofit institutions that aren't included when the Minnesota Private College Council is talking about their member institutions. There's also for-profit post-secondary institutions, and here's some examples of 4-year for-profit and 2-year for-profit institutions. A fair number of cosmetology schools might fall into that 2-year category. Throughout the presentation tonight, when I talk about colleges or I talk about universities, I'm talking about all of these different post-secondary educational opportunities. And so I might use college or university, and I'm not necessarily referring to a nonprofit or a for-profit or a public, unless I call that out as something very specific. Well, when we think about cost of attendance, if you're talking to someone who works in the financial aid office about the cost of attendance, we're required to answer that question in a very specific way. And we're required to include in that answer components like tuition and fees, which you're going to pay directly to the college or university. We're also required to include things like an allowance for books and supplies or transportation, miscellaneous personal expenses. So you're recognizing you're going to go out and buy a sweatshirt, or you're going to buy some deodorant, or you're going to buy a pizza, you're going to go to a movie, room and board. In fact, a few years back, I had a dad call me up because he was saying he received the financial aid offer from Bethel University, and we had a component in our cost of attendance for transportation. And he said, "What in the world are you charging my daughter for transportation for?" And it was like $600. Does she get a bus pass, or what is it you're giving to her? And I said, no. We know that there will be some expenses the family will incur related to transportation. That's not money you're going to pay directly to the college or university, but it is part of that living expense that you're going to incur while you're in school. And so in a little bit, we're going to talk about net price calculators, and we're going to try to focus on the difference between the additional cost of going to college compared to the costs you're already incurring that are part of your normal out-of-pocket expense, even while students are in high school. Well, the average annual expense, one-year expense for students, depending on the type of college or university they're choosing here in Minnesota, this is average expense for 2019-20, and this is that cost of attendance number. For private not-profit schools, so this would be a Bethel, a St. Thomas, a Gustavus, the average is $48,696, that average sticker price. Some are more, some are over $60,000, some are less, but that's the average amount. The average for private for-profit, about $31,000. The average University of Minnesota on campus, $27,000. Four-year state university, $20,000, and a two-year state college living off campus, the average cost of attendance, $19,000. Very common across all of these schools is a component for room and board. Room and board might be you're living in the residence hall at the campus. It might be you're living in an apartment. There's going to be expenses even if the student is living at home and commuting. There's a allowance built in for books and other supplies. And where you see the most significant variance by these different types of schools is in the tuition and fees that are charged, the sticker price for tuition and fees. Now, many times here, for example, is in 2019-20, what's the typical tuition and fees for 1 year? At Minnesota Community and Technical Colleges, the blue is the minimum, the green is the average, and the orange color is the maximum. There's not a lot of variance across the community college or the Minnesota college, two-year college system. There's some variance, but not a lot. Where you see the most variance is within the private not-for-profit schools. Go from an average of less than 10,000 to the maximum, this is the minimum of less than 10,000 to the maximum of over $50,000 for 1 year for tuition. Even at the University of Minnesota, the costs are different depending on the campus. So pay particular attention to what is the cost at the specific school, but also the campus you're considering attending. Now, one way to reduce costs is to think about tuition reciprocity. And this applies if you're considering a public college in North or South Dakota, Wisconsin, also in Manitoba. And the idea of tuition reciprocity is it allows you to be charged a tuition rate that would be similar to if you chose the comparable public institution in Minnesota. Here's an example at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. So the peer institution in Minnesota would be University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. And if you go to the University of Wisconsin at Madison, if you go to their website, their tuition and fees website, this is a piece of what you'll see. For the fall of 2020, the amount of tuition you pay differs depending on how many credits you're taking. So if you're a full-time student taking 12 to 18 credits and you're from Wisconsin, you're going to be charged $5,300 for your tuition for that semester. If you're not from Wisconsin, the normal rate is $19,000 for one semester at University of Wisconsin-Madison. And you might look at that and say, can't afford it. But keep on going because there's a separate rate for those of us that live in Minnesota. And if we live in Minnesota and we decide to go to Madison, the tuition as a full-time for one semester is about $7,400. And that's really close to the tuition rate you'd be charged if you went to the University of Minnesota Twin Cities campus. Now, not included in this rate on this particular website for Wisconsin, this is their tuition. And over here, the U of M is talking about tuition and fees. So again, as you build out the cost of education, think about tuition, also think about fees. And this is the fee structure, again, at University of Wisconsin-Madison. The undergraduate fees are about $730 per semester. So sometimes the fees are fairly modest, sometimes the fees add up. So make sure when you're looking at the cost of tuition and fees, these are the fees that are going to be charged to all of their full-time undergrads, and it goes to help cover expenses like their Wisconsin union. And so watch for the tuition portion, also watch for the fee portion as you're building out this cost of the different schools. Any questions at this time, John?
Not yet, Jeff. Thank you.
Okay. Yep. We'll keep on going. Is the post-secondary education worth the investment? Or we're going to look at a little bit of data on things like unemployment rates and wages to give an idea of, is it worth investing in a post-secondary education? This is the unemployment rate across the United States from 1992 through 2020. And it's for people who are aged 25 years or older. And it's broken down by the level of post-secondary education. This grayish black line at the bottom is the unemployment rate over time for people with a bachelor's degree and higher, bachelor's or master's degree. The yellow or the gold color are students who have a college associate degree. Green is high school graduate, but no college, and the blue is less than a high school diploma. And what you see is all over time, the unemployment rate varies, but there's a correlation between more post-secondary education and the unemployment rate for that group of people is lower. It's not that we're not going to lose our jobs just because we've gone to college, but the chance of losing the job is less based on this type of data. A second thing to look at are the median earnings, and I lost my scale, so apologize for that. But again, what we're looking at here is the median full-time earnings. Let me see if I can escape out of this and get the scale back real quickly. Can you see the scale now? Okay, I just went out of the presentation mode, and what we can see now is the median annual earnings for full-time employees grouped by ages. So people who are 25 to 34 years of age, 35 to 44, 45 to 54 in this middle area, 55 to 64, and then 65 on up. And again, it's stacked by the level of education. So this green at the bottom here are high school 9th through 12th grade. The purple is high school graduate, some college, associate degree, bachelor's degree, master's degree, professional doctorate. And what you're seeing is sometimes the band is tighter, but over time, oftentimes you hear people talk about the earnings are greater for college students. This is illustrating that median annual earnings. So median is the middle in these bands of earnings across time in 2019. Now, it's also important to keep in mind that when we talk about median earnings for someone with a bachelor's degree, it makes a difference which kind of bachelor's degree you're pursuing. And this is looking at national data. At the entry level, individuals in the health majors earn about $41,000 annually compared to the humanities and liberal arts that are earning about $29,000 just at the entry level. So when you're thinking, go to college, I get big bucks. Well, if you choose to be a philosophy major or a history major like me, you're going to be at the lower end of that spectrum as compared to you choosing to go into a medical profession or engineering. You're going to start out at a higher pay scale. Here in Minnesota, this is looking at median wages for 2010-11 graduates of Minnesota post-secondary institutions. And what we see, that range went from $33,000 if your major was East Asian languages or literature or linguistics, up to $74,000 for computer engineering. So the amount of money you're going to earn is in part tied to getting additional training in college after high school, but also pay attention to the type of degree you're pursuing. The next theme has to do with how to pay for college. We're just going to pause for a moment, see if there's any questions.
Jeff, we're good so far.
All right. So how to pay for college. One of the best ways to figure out how to pay for college is to talk to people who have been in college. And Sally Mae, along with Ipsos, has done a survey for the last 6 or 7, 8 years. And each year they go out and they ask families who have college students, they ask the college students and they ask the parents, and they just say, how did you pay for college? And this is a sample of those responses over the last 5 years. And what we're seeing is there's a small percent that relatives and friends are chipping in. So don't be bashful about saying, hey, grandma and grandpa, do you want to chip in and help my kid go to college? Again, it never hurts to ask, and a few people are getting some help that way. The scholarships and grants, look at it over time, 25% of the school bill was covered through scholarships and grants through 35%, a quarter to a third. Income and savings, this is money that's just coming out of your paychecks. About 40 to 50% of the costs are covered by income and savings. And then borrowing. This might be borrowing where the student is borrowing, or it might be money that the parent is borrowing. And in most cases, it's a combination of those. We'd all love to be able to go to college and the scholarships and grants are covering the whole thing. And that's great if that happens. But many times it's a combination of asking the question, how much can I afford out of pocket? Let's get some scholarships and grants if we can. And then look at borrowing, but not excessively, because you want to make sure that depending on what your major is, you're earning a rate of living that you don't have to go back and live with mom and dad forever in order to pay off your educational loans. Now, when we talk about financial aid, it's really important to understand who you're talking to. If you're talking to someone who works in the financial aid office, and we're talking about financial aid, we're talking about grants and scholarships, and this is the best kind of financial aid because this is the kind of aid you don't have to pay back. Sometimes it's called gift aid. We're also talking about loan eligibility. A loan is money that you've got to pay back. Sometimes it's in the student's name, sometimes it's in the parent's name, sometimes it's a loan where the student is the borrower and the parent had to co-sign to get that loan. We also talk about student employment eligibility. Student employment reminds me of when I was a student at St. Thomas, and I went through the process and they said, you've got to buy a parking permit. And so I went and I stood in line to get my parking permit. And I was so excited when I got that permit because I was having a hard time finding a place to park down near the campus. And as I was leaving, the person handed me the permit and they said, you realize what this is, don't you? And I said, well, it's my parking permit. And he said, yeah, but that only means you have permission to look for a place to park. There's no guarantees that you'll find a place to park, but now you've got permission. So if you find a spot, you won't be towed. Student employment is a lot like that. The school is going to tell you if you're eligible for something like federal work study or Minnesota work study, and that's permission to look for a job on campus. But you still have to take the initiative and go through the hoops to apply for that job and get hired and actually show up to work and get your paycheck. So you're not like the young man who came to see me, oh, this is 10 years ago now, just before Thanksgiving. And he came in, he says, Mr. Olson, I came to get my work study grant. And I looked at him and I was just confused. I said, what's he talking about? Because in my mind, work study is one type of financial aid, a grant is another. And he said, well, on the last summer, you sent me a letter and said I was eligible for $2,200 in work study grant. I never got the money, so I'd like the check now. So I encouraged him to have a seat, and we talked about these differences in the different types of financial aid. And over the years, I've told this story a lot, and I am so grateful that young man came to see me because I thought our financial aid offers were really clear, but they're not. And when you're new to the whole financial aid conversation, when you see a financial aid offer and there's all kinds of names of different programs on there, it's not always really clear. This is a grant or a scholarship or a loan or student employment. And as the student and as a parent, you've got to take time to make sure you understand exactly what the colleges are offering to you and whether it's some type of grant or scholarship or loan or student employment. Now, when we're looking for financial aid and we're looking in particular for the grants and scholarships, boy, if you know where the money is, that's where you want to hone in and you want to look for that money there. In 2017-18 in the state of Minnesota, there was about $1.5 billion in grants and scholarships that went out to students in undergraduate programs. And just over half of that money came from the colleges and universities. So it's really important when you're looking for grants and scholarships, check out the different colleges, universities, and find out what's your deadline? You don't want to be caught off guard that you've missed out on an opportunity for a grant or a scholarship by the school, because each school will have a different deadline for their institutional money. And we'll talk about this in a little more detail in a few more slides. So almost 60% of the money in 2017-18 came from the colleges, universities. About a quarter of it came from the federal government. And most of this is in the form of the federal Pell Grant. And the way you apply for the federal Pell Grant is you complete the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA form. 13% of the money came from the state of Minnesota. Most of that's in the form of the Minnesota State Grant. And the way you apply for the Minnesota State Grant is you complete the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA. So by checking into the different scholarship and grant opportunities at the college where you're applying and completing the FAFSA, you've looked where 95% of the grants and scholarships are coming from. Now, that doesn't say give up on the private money. John, as he began in talking about these private scholarships, that's so important to look for that. It may be 5%, but it's still $71 million. And a couple $100 here, $500 there, that all adds up. And you might be like the young woman 20 years ago who sent me the thank you note. Her parents had a turkey farm, and she had done the math on the scholarship that we offered her, and she had calculated how many hours less time she had to work in the turkey barns as a result of getting that scholarship. If you're getting a job and you're earning $10 an hour and you get a $500 scholarship, that's a substantial amount of time that you don't have to be working to come up with those dollars. So look for those grants and scholarships and make sure you're applying on time. Now, just because you might be thinking, well, I'm going to Century College, I don't know if they've got a grant or scholarship. This is again data from the Minnesota Office of Higher Education showing in 2017-18, this orangish color line are the percent of students who received a grant or scholarship from the college and university. And the encouraging thing here is maybe fewer students are getting a grant or scholarship from the two-year colleges, but still 5% of the students are getting that grant or scholarship. So don't be hesitant about asking. The admissions office is prepared to answer that question. The financial aid office is prepared to answer that question and coach you through the process to see what type of grant or scholarship they can give you to help make college affordable at those different campuses. This is very similar to that first information about looking for the private scholarships. And again, I would really reinforce, check out the online tools, but also look in your local community. Make sure you're checking out that MEDI resource, that MEF resource, and look with the parents' employers. That's where we see most of the students who are coming to Bethel College. If they come with a scholarship with them that they've received, most of that money is coming from their local community where they've got some kind of connection. It's from their place of worship, it's from the Rotary Club, it's from the Lions Club, it's from the organizations that are giving scholarships out through the counseling office at the different high schools. And make sure you just ask the question. It never hurts to, hey, if you got a scholarship opportunity I can apply for. Worst cases, they say no. Best cases, they say yes. and you apply and you get the scholarship. So make sure to ask those kinds of questions.
Just a couple things, Jeff. We appreciate, we got a question coming through, and you can choose to answer it now or later. When it comes up, does it make sense to use your 529 money up front or spread it out over years?
That's a good question. Yeah. I don't know the answer to that. And part of that is because families are at different extremes on the spectrum of eligibility for need-based aid. But we'll talk about 529 plans when we get into the need analysis piece and looking at the FAFSA. And we'll also talk about that as we get into this net price calculator conversation. It'll show you how you could find an answer to that question. So as we look at how to apply for financial aid, John, in his slide, he talked about net price calculators and gave an example of University of Minnesota Duluth. This is a wonderful tool, wonderful resource to get a ballpark idea of what it's going to cost specifically for you to go to a particular college or university. And what you want to do is you want to open up a browser and type in the phrase net price calculator up here at the top. Get back to my little laser pointer, net price calculator, type that in and the name of the school. And what we've got here, I've done a case study and I refreshed it this fall, looking at a family of four where there's two parents, two kids, one college student. They live in Minnesota and the parents' adjusted gross income is in this $50,000 to $60,000 range. Now, net price is the total cost of attendance. That includes your pizza money. The total cost of attendance minus the gift aid, the grants and scholarships, equals the estimated net price. And all colleges that participate in federal financial aid programs are required to have this type of a tool on their website. Now, we're going to start by talking about the University of Minnesota Twin Cities net price calculator. And this particular tool, it's really important when you get to the website, read some of the fine print. They've done a great job of explaining what their net price calculator does and what it does not do. University of Minnesota Twin Cities net price calculator provides an estimate of need-based financial aid. Need-based. They offer merit scholarships, and they talk about that a little bit further down here. So there's information you can go to check out the merit scholarships at the University of Minnesota, but their net price calculator is not designed to answer the question, will you qualify for a merit scholarship? Now, as you continue on with the University of Minnesota Twin Cities net price calculator, they've got a very straightforward, very simple to answer tool. You check some questions like weighted versus unweighted grade point average, and the tool will tell you whether this even makes any difference. This isn't going to make any difference in the financial aid eligibility because they're not estimating merit aid. But you'll answer some questions. This particular tool gives you a chance, if you've already done the FAFSA and you know what your expected family contribution is, you can say, I know what my EFC is, and you just put in that number because you've done the FAFSA. Otherwise, you can say, I'm going to choose a limited financial aid process, or I'm going to do the full thing. I'm going to answer 70 questions. So in my example, I chose this limited number. There were maybe 15 questions that I answered about family size, numbering, college, income for the parents and the students. And as I entered in that information, what it told me on the screen is we estimate that your expected family contribution is about $1,400. And then you go to the next screen and they're calculating for you what is your estimated net price. And the estimated net price per year is $13,400. $13,400. And they've laid out their costs really nicely. Here's the cost for the tuition and fees, the housing, the books, the transportation, which incidentally is pretty close to the price of a bus pass. Student fees, other expenses. So here's the subtotal of the estimated grants and scholarships that they think you'll receive, around $15,600, and they've named them. The estimate for the Pell Grant, state grant, a UPromise scholarship, supplemental education opportunity grant. And so the difference, cost of attendance minus the grants and scholarships, is this estimated amount you'll pay for college. Now, sometimes you look at that number, you say, that's just too big. How am I going to come up with that? And a lot of net price calculators go on, and the U of M has done a nice job with this. They've said you can work, and if you are working about 10 hours a week, you'll earn around $2,700 over the year. That'll pay for your out-of-pocket expenses while you're in school that are included in that cost of attendance budget. There's some loan options. As a student, you can borrow a subsidized and an unsubsidized loan. A parent can borrow a federal parent loan, or maybe they'll co-sign a private loan. And this is a way that you can come up with some other resources. They've also got ideas out there where, well, you might be able to get a different private scholarship, or you sign up for a payment plan. And so the net price calculators give you ideas of how you can come up with ways to be able to pay that school bill. Here's the net price calculator. We're not going to go into all that detail with each of the campuses, but I use that same Minnesota dependent student with two parents. The parents are married. There's 4 in the family, 1 in college, adjusted gross income between $50,000 and $60,000. And so we've got Anoka Ramsey, U of M Twin Cities that we just looked at. There's that net price of $13,400. St. Cloud State, Harvard, St. Thomas, and Bethel. Check out the net price at each of the campuses: $9,600, $13,400, $14,000, $3,500. And St. Thomas, they've approached this in a very interesting way. They've, on their net price calculator, they've said, well, it's a range, and it's between a low number and a high number. And so you're saying, well, it's someplace between $24,000 and $29,000. It's kind of nice. You're not locking in on just one number. At Bethel, we're saying it's around $22,000, $23,000. This is all for the same family. The family of 4, and their income is $50,000 to $60,000 a year. Look at Harvard. The estimated net price is only $3,500. Their cost of attendance is $75,000, but they're offering $72,000 in grants and scholarships. Harvard, and when you look at their financial aid website, what you see is they don't offer merit scholarships, but they help needy students. This is a really needy student. Your pat on the back and getting it at Harvard isn't that you get a merit scholarship, it's that you got admitted. You got to be pretty bright to be admitted to Harvard University. And so the way that the institutions use their own institutional grants and scholarships vary significantly from one school to the next. So it's important as you're looking at this estimated net price or the financial aid is to ask the question, how is this going to vary from one school to the next? Well, a moment ago, we had a question about 529 plans, and this is a way that you can use the net price calculator to help answer that question. Oftentimes, parents' assets, the idea is if I've saved up money for college, that's going to impact eligibility for grants, and it's going to drive up the amount that my students have to pay. When you use a net price calculator similar to the one that's on the University of Minnesota Twin Cities website, where they're actually asking questions about your assets, you can go through that net price calculator a couple of times. And you go through it the first time, and this is what we did a moment ago, and we said the parent's income was $50,000 and they had zero for cash savings and checking. And we went there at the end and we saw the net price is $14,300. Go back and do the net price calculator a second time and pop in some cash savings or your 529 plan. If you've got $50,000 in the 529 plan, you put that in there as net investments for the parent. And then you ask the question, how big of a difference did that make on the out-of-pocket cost? So in this example, where the family had $50,000 of assets they had to report, and keep in mind on the FAFSA, you do not report the value of your home. You do not report the value of your personal retirement funds. So this is cash, or this is money that you've invested in some type of stock, or this is your portion of the cabin up north that you share with your siblings. And if you had to sell it off next week, how much money are you going to split between you and your siblings? Those are the kinds of assets that are being included here. And what we see in this example, adjusted gross income is $50,000 and they have $50,000 of assets to go on the FAFSA. The difference for 1 year is only $900. That's not much of a penalty for having $50,000 that you've saved that has to be reported on the FAFSA. The challenge with this example is, frankly, we don't see this very much. We don't see families where their adjusted gross income is $50,000 and they have $50,000 that they have to report of assets on the FAFSA. So let's look at what happens if the family's income is $120,000. $120,000 and no assets that have to be reported on the FAFSA. Again, we're using the University of Minnesota net price calculator that's only looking at eligibility for need-based aid. How much need-based aid is a student eligible for? About $300. The out-of-pocket expense is just over $28,000. That same family going through and completing the net price calculator and reporting $50,000 of assets, what's the amount of gift aid? It's $300. The out-of-pocket expense is the same. So this is a way that you can use the net price calculators to get an idea of, will that 529 plan impact you? And if you see there's going to be a big difference, that's where then you say, well, maybe I use the 529 plan money up front, or maybe I use it later. But this is a way that each situation is so unique. Typically speaking, when we're looking at need-based aid, once the income starts getting up there, that's the key factor in impacting eligibility for need-based aid, and the impact of the assets is a much smaller impact. And generally speaking, the family with the larger assets tends to have the larger income as well. Now, in a moment, we're going to talk about different kinds of applications for financial aid. Some students are not going to be completing the free application for federal student aid. If the student graduated from Minnesota high school but is an undocumented student, is not a U.S. citizen, is not an eligible non-citizen, then in Minnesota, these students have the opportunity to apply for the Minnesota DREAM Act. And this is the general eligibility requirements. They have to have attended a Minnesota high school for at least 3 years. They graduate or earn a Minnesota GED. For males, if they're required to, they need to register for selective service. Currently, I don't believe that's a requirement, but if that were to change, they would have to register. And then they need to apply for lawful immigration status if that's available. Again, I'm not sure that that's available. But the Minnesota DREAM Act, students complete that on the Minnesota Office of Higher Education website. This opens the door for those students then to be eligible for the in-state tuition rates, which are much lower than the out-of-state rates. It also opens the door for them to be eligible for programs like the Minnesota State Grant or the Minnesota Self-Loan, some of the state-funded private scholarships available through the public schools. So it opens the door for financial aid resources that are linked to Minnesota. These students will not be eligible for federal Pell Grant. They're not going to be eligible for federal student loans, but it does open the door for Minnesota financial aid resources. I'm going to skip over this. This is a great summary on the federal student aid website that just talks about the different aspects of financial aid. So you can come back later, click this link. It's succinct. It's going to be much shorter than I'm talking, and you'll have all the information you want to know about applying for federal student aid right at your fingertips. Well, let's talk about filling out the free application for federal student aid, or the FAFSA form. And there's 4 different ways that families can complete the FAFSA. The most common is logging online, and that's what we're going to focus on. But if you want the paper copy, you can get a copy of the paper FAFSA. You can go to the website and download it, or you can call a phone number and have the U.S. Department of Education mail you a paper copy of the free application for federal student aid. You can also download a mobile app and load it onto your tablet or onto your phone, and you can do your FAFSA that way. A few years ago, I thought to myself, I'm going to download this app, and I'm going to go through and do my FAFSA on my phone, and then I'm going to go to the high schools and do my financial aid night. I'm going to say, this is just horrible. Don't do this. It was really slick. I've got to tell you, it caught me off guard big time. But if you download it, and you don't have to have access to a computer anymore to do this. You can do it on your phone, and the size of the screen changes depending on the size of your mobile device. So you can apply for the FAFSA on your phone, and it's no longer like navigating this website where you've got to kind of push your way all over the place to find where you're at on the website. The mobile app works really well. Well, one of the questions regarding completing the free application for federal student aid is when to do that. And so I reached out to the Minnesota financial aid community this last fall, and I said to them, I said, pretend you're talking to a family. That family is only considering your school. When would you tell them to do the FAFSA? And these are the responses. We had 54 different colleges from Minnesota that responded. 37 of those schools said, do your FAFSA in October during the fall of your senior year of high school. Get the FAFSA done then. The earliest you can do it is October 1st. And the recommendation, 37 schools said October, another 7 said November, a few trickled on, but the basic premise is schools are saying, get your FAFSA done in the fall of your senior year. Well, then I said, okay, the family does the FAFSA October 1. When do we, the schools, start sending out financial aid offers to those incoming students? And only one of the schools said they begin sending out financial aid offers in October. 4 schools said November, and then it starts picking up. And we've got some schools that they're not able to begin sending out financial aid offers to the summer. And this frequently are the 2-year schools where they may not have a lot of institutional grants or scholarships, and they're waiting for the legislature to set the tuition rate for the upcoming school year. They're waiting for the legislature to set the formula for the Minnesota State Grant. And so these other roadblocks, you've done your FAFSA back in October, but you may have to wait a while to hear from the college or university how much financial aid is going to be available at your school. Don't misinterpret that as the school is ignoring you. They're trying to get those financial aid offers out as quickly as they can, but the circumstances are different. In particular, look at the difference here between this is 4-year schools in Minnesota. So 33 of the 4-year schools responded, and the nonprofit 4-year schools, they tended to be able to get their financial aid offers out sooner than the publics who are waiting until January or February. Again, that's not an indication that you're not wanted at the public schools. It's just certain information isn't available to give you a good answer to your question, what kind of financial aid is available? And the schools want to wait and make sure they give you really good information before they start sending out those responses. Here are the 2-year schools in Minnesota and when they begin sending out financial aid offers to incoming new students who are going to begin in the fall of 2021. Well, the last question I asked the schools, I said, okay, we've talked about get your FAFSA done right away, hurry up and wait for the financial aid offer, But at the end of the day, when it comes to institutional grants and scholarships, that it's not competitive. It's not like you're competing for the top academic scholarship or the top music scholarship. The general kinds of grants or scholarships your schools might offer, when's the latest that an incoming freshman can fill out the FAFSA and still qualify? A couple schools said December, but generally speaking, the colleges, universities are saying for our generic grants and scholarships, we'll treat you the same if you get everything turned in May as if you turned in everything in October. So there's this hurry up, get your FAFSA done, because you don't want to miss out on something. And some schools will look at the date the FAFSA has arrived for limited resources from the institution and say, we've only got a pot of $30,000 of federal supplemental education opportunity grant. We're going to get that out in the order that FAFSAs came in for needy students. And that money runs out by January. So there is a reason to get the FAFSA turned in earlier, but not to panic, not to feel like I didn't get around till February. That no panic. Go ahead and do the FAFSA and get the financial aid offer and see what type of aid is available to help you out. Well, before we get into the federal student aid ID, any questions?
There's a few questions, Jeff.
We have a couple.
Yeah, so first question, can you go through the FAFSA process multiple times? For example, while your child is a freshman, just to start estimating, or should you only do it once at the appropriate time?
That's a good question. The answer is no, you can't go through the FAFSA multiple times. Now, the U.S. Department of Education has what they call a FAFSA forecaster. The FAFSA forecaster is designed for parents of students who are in grade 9, 10, 11, and they want to have the experience of going through and doing the free application for federal student aid before they're a senior. So you could look for the FAFSA forecaster and do that as grade 9 or grade 10 and get an idea of what the FAFSA outcome is going to be. I would strongly encourage you to use the net price calculators, because the difference between estimating the FAFSA is the FAFSA is all about federal financial aid. And we'll see a slide in a moment that talks about once you get all the way through the FAFSA, what information does that give you? It gives you an index number that we call an expected family contribution. That doesn't help. I mean, you think the lower the number, the better, but it really doesn't tell you how much you're going to pay for school. The FAFSA results will tell you if you're eligible for the federal Pell Grant, and then it will tell you you're eligible for loans. And every new student who does the FAFSA, it's going to say you're eligible for $5,500 in loans. So FAFSA is going to answer whether you qualify for the Pell Grant, and it's going to tell everybody you qualify for $5,500 in loans. But going through the FAFSA will not answer the question, what type of grant or scholarship am I going to receive from the college or university? And remember, in the state of Minnesota, 60% of the grants and scholarships are coming from the college or university. And so that's where, by going back and doing the school's net price calculator, you're going to get a better ballpark idea of how much total gift aid you're going to receive from the school and from the federal Pell Grant and the Minnesota State Grant. That'll all be wrapped up in the net price calculator, assuming that merit aid is included. And sometimes you'll just have to do a different tool on that website to get a ballpark idea of merit aid.
So next question goes from a junior family. It says, when should parents be filling this out? You know, there's different examples. The FAFSA example said to submit it in October. So if you were a parent, when would you do it?
Yeah, if I
With all
was
the data, you know.
Yep. If it was my child going to school, I'd be doing the FAFSA in October of the senior year, and then I'd be prepared to sit and wait and know that the schools are going to say, hey, thanks for the FAFSA data. And then depending on the schools I'm going to, I might have to wait 2, 3, 4 months to get a financial aid offer from that school. But I would want to get my FAFSA data turned in at the front of the line, just so I don't possibly miss out on something that is associated with the date that FAFSA was turned in.
Jeff, one more question. So the FAFSA example, like Keith just mentioned, said to submit in October. What if you are applying to multiple schools? When should you complete the FAFSA?
Yeah, still do my recommendation is still do the FAFSA in October. And when you do the free application for federal student aid, and we'll see this in a slide in just a moment, you identify what college is to receive the FAFSA. And you have to choose at least one college. You may choose up to 10. So you do the FAFSA one time, and then that information goes to all of the different schools that you authorize to receive that information. But so you just do the FAFSA once. You might change your mind later and you might say, well, I was thinking of these 3 schools in October and now it's December and I've got another school. You just log back into the FAFSA website and you say, please send the results from my application back in October. Please send that data to this other school, and the U.S. Department of Education will do that for you.
Jeff, can we just ask one more question?
Sure.
So once you've done the FAFSA and your child has completed the Common App to apply to schools, is this all that is needed to ask for a financial aid offer, or are there other steps?
Oh, that's really good. The answer will vary depending on the school. So I'll try to be generic, but the Common App is applying for admission. You still have to be admitted. So it will depend on the timeline at the individual campus and when they begin admitting students on their campus. So at Bethel, we begin admitting students in late September. Some campuses may not begin admitting students until November or December or January. So before you're going to get a financial aid offer, the student needs to be admitted. In addition to doing the free application for federal student aid, some students are selected for verification, and we'll have that as a slide in a little bit. And that just means it's an audit process. And the school will ask the family for some information to verify that, yes, your family size is accurate on the FAFSA, the number in college is accurate, the income is accurate. So some families are going to go through that extra process. And then at the individual campus level, for some of the competitive scholarships, there may be additional applications you need to complete. So at Bethel, again, as an example, if you're competing for one of our music performance scholarships, you're going to have to audition. And there'll be some hoops you jump through in order to audition for that. So if you're applying for some of those competitive types of scholarships, you want to be in touch with the school to see what else you have to do. But on many campuses, completing the common application, sending in your high school transcript and test score, if that's required, you get admitted, and a lot of schools will use that information to determine eligibility. If they offer some type of an academic scholarship, they just use the information you provided as part of applying for admission to determine eligibility for that academic scholarship.
Another question we get commonly asked is if their family goes through a hardship or a situation between the time they submit their FAFSA and the time they are, considering colleges, how would a parent or family during this COVID time and difficult time go about getting assistance with that?
Yeah.
How would they go about appealing or getting support?
I'd like to hold off on responding to that. We've got a slide devoted right to these special circumstances coming up in about 20 slides. So we'll cover that in a little bit.
Perfect.
All right, thanks. When completing the application, the FAFSA, if you're completing the application on paper, when it comes time to sign it, you just grab your pen and you sign the paper and you drop it in the mail. But if you're completing the application online, the mobile app or the FAFSA on the web, the student and the parent need an ID. It's called the Federal Student Aid ID. It seems like it might be complicated, and sometimes it is. Most of the time, it's really straightforward. The Federal Student Aid ID, it's just a username and a password. So for the dependent student will need a Federal Student Aid ID. So the student applies for her own FSA ID, and then the parent, one parent needs to have a Federal Student Aid ID. So if there are 2 parents in the family, only one of the parents needs to have the FSA ID. It's whoever's going to be helping and signing off on the FAFSA. That Federal Student Aid ID, the username doesn't expire, but you will have to reset your password every once in a while. So just keep that in mind. A couple of tips when you're creating your FSA ID, my recommendation is do this at least 3 days before you sit down and do the FAFSA. Or do it exactly the same time that you do your FAFSA. But don't do the application for the FSA ID on Monday and then decide on Tuesday you're going to go do the FAFSA, because the processing time is typically about 3 business days. And if you start the process and then try to go back and use it, sometimes the wires get crossed. The second recommendation is they're going to give you an opportunity to verify your email or verify your phone number. Take the few minutes to do that. It's so helpful. if you're like me, you're going to forget your password because they make you create one of these really robust passwords. You stand up, sit down, turn around, and you got to do all of that in order to be able to get the password entered again. And it's going to reset on you. And so if you have validated your email and you've got to reset the password, they'll send something to your email address. It's really easy to get it reset. Otherwise, you've got to create, I think it's 3 to 5 question and answer types of things where what's your mother's maiden name kind of a deal. And if you use that to reset the password, then what happens is there's a 30-minute delay after you reset the password before you can use the FSA ID. And so if you reset the password by your telephone number or your email, you can jump right in and keep doing it. So again, there are challenge questions that you can use if you change your email, but I would strongly recommend take a couple minutes, verify that information by the phone number or the email address. As a parent, should you create the federal student aid for your child? Absolutely not. I mean, first, the feds will say it's a big no-no. But more importantly than that, when I'm talking with families and they're having problems with the FAFSA, 9 times out of 10, the dad or the mom says, I created the FSID for my son, or I created it for the daughter. And typically this is what happens. They sit down to create the federal student aid ID. The parent puts in his or her email address, and now that's linked to the child's federal student aid account. Then the parent goes through and tries to create his own FSA ID, and you can only have one email attached to the account. So I've already used my email from my son or my daughter. Now I can't use my email from my son or daughter. So now I'm going to switch them around, and I'm going to use my daughter's email, and it's me. And that kind of a scenario, and it doesn't take very long at all to get all twisted around. Best practice is sit down, take a half hour with your student, sit down and say, we're going to create the federal student aid ID together, and just get that done. A few tips on completing the FAFSA on the web. So we're not going to go through every question. The resources online are so helpful when you're going through and doing the FAFSA on the web. These are some of the documents that you'll need to have available to you. In a moment, we're going to talk about how you can pull data right from the IRS website and load that into your FAFSA, but not all of that tax information comes through. So it's still a good idea to have a copy of your 1040 with you. And when you're applying for financial aid for the 2021-22 school year, subtract 2, so you need income from 2019. So you want a copy of your 2019 federal tax return with you as you're sitting down and completing the free application for federal student aid. When you get to the FAFSA website, you just click on, if you're new to the process, you click on Start Here. There will be an option if you've done this and this is your second year, or you're a returning user, you're going to go back and add a school, then you just log in here. So you check one of the two, but we're going to pretend that you're that first-time user, and you'll click on Start Here. Once you get there, you log in, and if you're the student, you click on the left-hand side. If you're the parent, you click on the right-hand side. And don't pretend to be one or the other. If I'm the dad and I click the student side, the questions are going to be phrased as though the student is completing the form. What is your social security number? And they want to know the student's social security number. And if I'm the dad and I'm pretending to be the student, I'm going to get confused, and I'm going to put my social security number in instead of my student's. So if you're the parent, you can go down that path and you just put in the student's first name, student's social security number, and the student's date of birth, and you can get right into the FAFSA and begin entering the information on behalf of your student. The second thing that sometimes throws students off is they're not sure which FAFSA to complete. And most of the year, you can apply for 2 FAFSAs. Now, this screenshot I put together in September. It was before the new FAFSA season had opened. So that this has a 2020-21 or a 19-20 FAFSA. So right now, it would say 2020-21, the current year, or 2021-22 school year. So you would want to click on the 2021-22 school year if you're applying for financial aid and you plan to start in the fall. If you're beginning school in the summer, you graduate in May or June, and you're going right to college, you probably want to do the 2020-21 school year, because frequently summer is fall, spring, summer. It's the tail end of the academic year. So check out at the college or university. If you're going to go to summer school, you probably want to do the 2021 FAFSA for the summer of 2021. And here's where you see that FAFSA renewal option that makes it a little bit easier in year 2 or year 3. There's also some options if you're a parent and you've got more than one student. You can click on this option to transfer some of your data from student 1 to student 2's FAFSA. Now, after you create the Federal Student Aid ID, you think, I'm in. I've got this password that's this long. And now what do you mean by a save key? Well, the save key can be short. I put in something as short as I can, 4 characters. And the purpose of the save key is if I'm starting to work on the FAFSA and I get called to dinner before I finish the FAFSA, I use the save key to go back and retrieve the information I started to enter, but I didn't hit the submit button yet. So the save key is really helpful if you need to do the FAFSA at more than one sitting. Or maybe your student is in Iowa and you're in Minnesota and you're doing your part in Minnesota, and then you contact the student, you say, do your part in Iowa. That's where you can then share that save key, and you can each enter your own portion of the FAFSA data. As you're working your way through the FAFSA, you'll see across the top an indication of how far you're at. You start with the student demographics, a lot of basic types of information. And what I've done here is I did the FAFSA and just did some screenshots of my information. So you'll see things like my name every once in a while as we go through this. Here's the question about colleges. And when you get to the question about colleges, it's going to ask, do you know your federal student code? Colleges used to be really adamant about make sure you write down our code because you need that to fill it out on the paper FAFSA. But this is an online tool, and so you're just going to use these options to click, and you type in Minnesota, and you type in the name of a school, and you hit the search button, and really quickly you'll identify that federal school code. It's a really simple process. Now you have to ask the data to go to at least one school. You may choose up to 10 schools and have that FAFSA go there. Sometimes I get the question, well, what if I want to apply to 20 schools? And well, you can do that, but you're going to do it in steps. Step 1 is you do the FAFSA and you have it sent to 10 schools. Give that time to get processed, and that takes a couple business days. Then you log back in and you put in 10 new schools as recipients. And then that data is going out to all 20 different schools. Now, some of the common questions on the FAFSA has to do with, are you dependent or independent? And in FAFSA terms, dependent basically means you've got to include mom or dad's information. And so there's a series of questions on the FAFSA that have to do with the age of the student as to the time they're filling out the FAFSA. Is the student married? Is the student in a graduate program right now? This does not mean I've graduated from high school. It means you've earned your bachelor's degree and now you're working on a master's degree or doctorate. Is the student in the military? Is the student a parent and provides more than half the support for the student's child? Does the student have other dependents they're providing more than half the support for and will continue to do that through June 30, 22? Orphan award of the court, legal guardianship, homeless. And if students go through all of these questions and they say no, 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 then what that means for financial aid purposes is they're dependent and they're going to be expected to provide information about the parent. The next question then is which parent's information goes on the form? For some families, it's going to be pretty straightforward. The parents are married, they're biological or adoptive parents, and their data is all going to go on the FAFSA. If the parents are not married, but they're living together, then both of those biological parents' information goes on the FAFSA, even though they're not married. If the parents are divorced or separated, this is where you pause and you read the FAFSA instructions because it's not really intuitive. And the FAFSA instructions currently say that you provide information for the parent where the student lived most of the last year. So in the 12 months before completing the FAFSA, where did the student live? And if the student lived most of that time with parent 1, parent 1's information goes on the FAFSA. If that's mom, then mom's information goes on the FAFSA. And if mom has remarried, then it's mom and mom's spouse's information that goes on the FAFSA. If the student lived most of that year with parent 2, then it's just parent 2's information that goes on the FAFSA. And if that's dad, then dad's information goes on the FAFSA. And if dad is remarried, it's dad and dad's spouse's information that goes on the FAFSA. If the parent is single or widowed, then you only put the information about that single or widowed person on the FAFSA. If it's a recent change in marital status, and maybe in 2019 when you had your taxes, parents were married, and now we're looking at 2021 and the parents are not married. There's been a divorce, a separation, there's been a death. That's when you want to have a conversation with the financial aid office. And what we'll coach you to do is to fill out the income information as though it was only your income on the 1040. And what I tell families in those cases, I just say have the 1040 there in front of you, and in the margins off to the right, you look at the number. If there's a $10,000 number there, you ask how much of that money is your income, and you write that in the margin, and you keep that as your notes. And then it's that information you put in the margin, that's what is going to go on the FAFSA, not the combined income, when the combined income is no longer appropriate because that's for a different family group. Again, if the parents have remarried, then step parents information is included. Sometimes the student is living with a grandparent or foster parents. Grandparents information, foster parents information doesn't go on the FAFSA. And there may be cases where the student goes through and answers all of these dependency questions as no, and maybe the student is living with grandma and grandpa and there's no court order involved. That's the case where the student is probably going to want to reach out to the college or university and say, here's my unique circumstances. I don't know who my dad is. My mom has been in prison for the last 10 years and I've been raised by my grandma and grandpa. And then what's going to happen is the school may consider what's called a dependency override. So the FAFSA is going to say, are you going to provide information about the FAFSA? In this unique circumstance, the student will say, no, I'm not able to, and then contact the school. And the school will get documentation of the fact that, yes, you were raised by your grandparents, you're living with grandma and grandpa, and it's appropriate, even though you answered all those questions, no, it's appropriate that we consider you as an independent student for financial aid purposes. Otherwise, you're just going to answer the question, yes, I'll provide information about my parents. And then from this point forward, you just want to keep your parent one or parent two consistent in answering the questions. The kinds of information you'll be asked about your parent, you'll be asked about the first parent and the other parent, if there are two. You'll be asked the parent's name, their marital status, social security numbers. So if the student is sitting down and working on the FAFSA on their own, need to have mom or dad's social security number, the date of birth, parents' email, and the parent's state of residence. That's the kind of information that you'll need to put into the FAFSA on the demographic part for parents. Once you've determined that we've got, let's say there's two parents involved, now the question is how big is the household? And the FAFSA will help answer that question. So when we get to the household size, if you've identified that you've got two parents and they're married, it's going to say you've got two parents. And then you're the student, so we're up to family size of 3. And then it's asking the question, are there other people in the household that should be included on the FAFSA? And it's just talk you right through these questions, answer these questions, and you'll know whether you need to put other students in there. Again, for many times, it's really straightforward. There's 4 in the family. You're the oldest kid. You've got a younger sibling at home. You put in one more person, you get a family of 4. Blended families, it gets a little more complicated. Just take your time, work your way through this, and you'll be able to figure out how large the family size should be. The question marks over here are tips. If you've got questions about how to answer it, just click on that and it gives you some pointers as well. There's also a chat feature built into the FAFSA. So if you need some help in answering a question, you can reach out and either through chat or a phone number and call someone at the Federal Student Aid to help answer that question. Or you can reach out to the college you're considering attending to, and we'll give you some pointers on how to answer these questions. In terms of the number in college for 2021-22, this never includes parents. So if I'm in college and my son is in college and we're doing his FAFSA, it's just one in college on his FAFSA because the parent can't be counted as a college student. As we keep on going, we're going to get into the income information. And for 2021-22, it's going to ask information about the 2019 federal tax return. And I've answered some questions. Have I done my taxes already? Yes, I did. We did a married filed joint return. I'm presented with the option to link to the IRS. Click on that option and it takes me to the IRS website. I put in my mailing address that was included when I had submitted my tax return, and it finds my information. So here's Jeffrey Olson, and it says, we found your data. Do you want to have that transfer back to the FAFSA? I click the little box, say transfer now. I click on the transfer now. And then I go back to the FAFSA, and the question is, what's your adjusted gross income? And the answer is that's transferred from the IRS. So by going through the IRS data retrieval process, it cuts down a lot of data entry. It also reduces the chance you're going to be selected for verification, because now the Department of Education knows this data came directly from the IRS. You haven't changed any of the values. And so it's going to pass that on and say, you don't have to prove this to the school. IRS has already provided this information through your FAFSA right to the school. Now, some of the questions you'll still have to answer. So for example, how much did you earn from work? Or how much did your spouse earn from work? That kind of information currently does not pull from the IRS website and populate FAFSA. So that's when you're going to turn and look at your W-2s, or you're going to look at your tax documents to be able to answer the question, how much did you earn from work, for the parent and for the parent's spouse, or for the student or the student's spouse if the student is married. Now, some people will not be able to complete the IRS, or they won't be able to use the IRS data retrieval process. And it doesn't mean they've done anything wrong. The process just doesn't work for everybody. So if you got married and the marriage date is after January 2020 or later, IRS data retrieval isn't going to work. If your social security number starts with 666, the data retrieval isn't going to work. If you filed as a non-US tax return, then it's not going to work. If you filed as head of household or filed married, filing separate returns, the data retrieval process isn't going to work. So there are some cases where data retrieval doesn't work, or you might go through all the hoops and you find out saying it's stuck. What do I do? You just back out and you enter the information by hand. And you can continue on through and you can finish the FAFSA process. It's not broken just because you can't use data retrieval, but definitely give it a shot. I remember I was helping a student at Blaine High School a couple years ago, and we tried for a half hour to get the data retrieval to work. We just couldn't figure it out. She had moved multiple times in high school, and she didn't remember where her tax return was sent to. And so the idea of being able to get to the IRS website and put in the right address, that seems really easy if you never move, but if you're moving a lot, that can be a difficult question to answer. And so we just backed out and we said, we're going to go ahead and hand enter information rather than trying to do the data retrieval process. Now on the FAFSA, there's a few asset questions. And we talked a little bit about this when we were talking about net price calculators, but right now there are 3 different types of questions about assets. It's going to ask the cash, savings, and checking. That's what you've got in cash, what you've got in your checking and savings today. Sometimes people will say, well, I got paid today, but I pay my rent tomorrow. I get paid today, I pay my mortgage tomorrow. Which value do you use? Well, the technical answer is whatever you have in there on the day you do the FAFSA is what you report. The common sense idea is, if I'm going to pay $2,000 tomorrow through rent and mortgage and insurance, and that money is gone, I don't think there's a lot of damage in netting that out and having a different dollar amount. The second type of question on assets has to do with what's called net investments. Net meaning value minus some type of debt associated with that. This never includes your home that you live in, and it never includes your retirement plans, your 401k, your IRAs. That's not included. Now, if your retirement plan is to say, I'm going to take my earnings and go and buy a bunch of Apple stock, and you're playing in the stock market and you're saying, that's my retirement plan, those aren't retirement funds unless they're buried in some type of an IRA mutual plan. So that gets reported as stocks. But if you have a financial investment that is specifically a retirement investment tool, that's the kind of investment that is not included. 529 plans are reported, and they're reported as the value, the asset of the owner of the account. So if my wife and I have 4 kids and we open up 4 529 plans, and we've got $10,000 in each one of those plans, and my first son goes to college, when we're filling out his FAFSA, my son is the beneficiary. The parents are the owner of the 529 plan. So when I do son number 1's FAFSA, I've got to add up 10 plus 10 plus 10 plus 10. I've got to put down $40,000 of assets on my son's FAFSA, because that's the sum of all of those 529 plans. They're just like multiple savings accounts. They're in my name because I'm the owner. That's the way that the 529 plans are set up. And so they go as the parent asset on the FAFSA. And then it asks questions about family, farm, and business. The idea of the family, farm, and business, again, with the net investments and the family, farm, or business, if you own your own business, take the time to click on the question mark and read the fine print on the FAFSA when you get here. Because for a business owner, currently, if you employ fewer than 100 full-time employees, you don't put down the value of your business. So if you're like my dad and he's got a construction company and it's one plus a helper every once in a while, and he works out of his house, he doesn't have to estimate the value of his business on the FAFSA because he doesn't employ enough other employees. Same idea with the family farm. If you're living on the farm and you're working the farm, that's the family farm. You don't put down the value of the family farm on the FAFSA. But if you have an investment farm and you own the land and somebody else is working that land, then you put down the value of that investment farm. Now you're getting to the point of signing and submitting, and you're going to think you're done because you've been sitting in front of the computer for such a long time, and you got to keep on going. So you sign it, you've done the FSA ID for the student and for the parent, and you've signed it, and you click this button, you say sign it, you say, yes, I'm done, but not until you see the congratulations, because you sign it, and then after that, you've got to hit submit. And you hit that submit button, and then you'll see the congratulations, you finished, and there's your time. And it's going to have a value on there that says, here's your expected family contribution. And it's going to tell you if you're eligible for things like the federal Pell Grant or the direct student loans. And now, if you've done the FAFSA and you've got some kind of special circumstance, and this was the question that came up a little while ago, FAFSA is all based on the premise that your income 2 years ago is basically the same as it is now. So if your income in 2019 was higher and now it's lower because of any significant circumstance, then what you can do is reach out to the college or university, and the schools will have a special circumstance or an appeal process where you can fill out an appeal to say, here's my unique circumstances and why my income is less. We're getting a fair number of those questions right now related to COVID. And so there are typical responses. You lost your job last week. Okay, this is the process we're going to begin in 6 weeks. And we're going to wait about 5 or 6 weeks after that change of employment to give time for the family member to find out what kind of unemployment is available. Is there another job I can jump right into, so that we can have a realistic estimate for a 12-month period of what the family's income is going to be. Maybe you hit the pause and maybe you're getting paid more through some type of payment from the government, so your income hasn't dropped. We can then have that conversation in 4 or 5 weeks, and then the school can go through and do an appeal to change the data that you put on your FAFSA to make it more realistic for what you've documented as your unique circumstances. The response can be different from one school to the next, so you'll go through this appeal process at every individual campus. Save your notes, because oftentimes what you send to school 1, you can send that same information to school 2. We don't even care if it's the other school's form. We just want to see that information to be able to know, can we make some changes to your FAFSA so it better reflects your family circumstance, and then recalculate eligibility for financial aid. Any other questions?
Yeah, Jeff, there are a couple questions here. First question, if marital status changes after FAFSA has been submitted, are we stuck with that for the first year, or is there a process to revise?
I would reach out to the campus, and that's going to fall under the area of financial aid administrators are empowered to use professional judgment to understand unique circumstances. Again, there are some really tightly written rules around FAFSA, but the basic principle is FAFSA should reflect the family's ability to pay while you're in school. So the school might say, we're going to flag you for verification, and in flagging you for verification, that opens the door for us to go back and double check the family size. So then they'll say, prove your income and then prove your family size. And that's when you say, well, we no longer have a married parents. This is our unique circumstance. And then the school can move forward and make changes to the FAFSA. But that will be a question you ask at each school, and the answer might be a little bit different depending on the campus. If you're already eligible for the maximum amount of need-based grant, the school might say, there's no obligation that we need to go back and change this information. If it was accurate at the point in time when you turned it in, you're eligible for the maximum Pell Grant, the maximum Minnesota State Grant, maximum need-based aid. Let's just wait and deal with that next year. So the school is going to look at your unique circumstances and help you understand what are you required to do and what is optional. And let's only go down that optional path if it's going to make sense for your student to go down that path. All
right, couple more questions here. I'm going to read it word for word. I may have missed this, but for assets, if I have stock options from my employer, do I include those? Just report value at the time?
Yeah, great question on stock options. This is where you're going to read the fine print on the FAFSA. And you're going to open that up, and it's going to have a long list of what to include and what not to include. And for something that a trust fund, and I think this, I don't know a lot about stock options, but if it's something that has a future value, you use the net present value. What's the value of that option today? So if it's stock that you don't have the chance to sell it today, but in 5 years it's going to be worth some dollar amount, you figure out what's the net present value of that, and that's what you'd report as the value of that stock option.
Next question we have is, we already did the FAFSA, but realize we didn't include our 529. What should we do?
Great. You just go back to FAFSA website, and instead of I'm a new user, you go to the login area. And then after you log in, you go to the parent assets, add in the value of the 529 plan. You'll have to sign it again, hit submit, and that information will go to the colleges. And then if they haven't calculated the financial aid, they'll just use this new FAFSA data to calculate the financial aid eligibility. If they have already calculated the financial aid award, they'll recalculate, and maybe it makes a difference, maybe it doesn't. Yep.
And the last one here we have that is reporting, is there a cost to do the FAFSA or to have it sent to various schools?
Sometimes. There's not supposed to be a cost. And if you go through the US government website, it is a free application for federal student aid. But if you just Google and you go online and you say, I'm going to Google FAFSA, there have been a lot of creative people who, there used to be a website called FAFSA.com. And I was at Andover High School doing a person-to-person coaching people through doing the FAFSA. And after in about a half hour, a dad raises his hand and says, how come I've got to pay $95? And I said, because you don't listen to instructions. The dad just Googled, and it's so easy to do. And you have all the same FAFSA questions. Go to the FAFSA.gov website. There is no cost for filling out the FAFSA. There is no cost for having it sent to different schools. Now, if you're doing the College Board CSS profile, there is a cost for submitting that. But the free application for federal student aid is free. No cost. No colleges are not allowed to charge you anything for preparing a financial aid offer for you. We can charge you to apply for admission and say you have to be admitted before we tell you your financial aid eligibility, but schools are not allowed to charge you for the financial aid information.
Another question here, Jeff. If a sibling is in grad school, would that be considered a sibling in college for FAFSA purposes?
Yeah, if a sibling is in grad school, that sibling is going to be considered independent for financial aid purposes because of the fact that the sibling is in graduate school. So that sibling would not be considered a sibling on an undergrad student's FAFSA. Two kids in the family, two parents, one of the kids is in grad school. Even if mom and dad are helping to pay for grad school, that grad school student is not going to be in the younger siblings FAFSA because the student is already considered independent because of their own schooling.
Well, I don't see any other questions right now.
All right.
Anything else, Jeff?
Just a reminder that the information I'm giving you today is current and it applies to the 2021-22 school year. But for those of you who have students who will be in school in 2023-24, a lot of these rules are going to change for the 2023-24 school year. So maybe your student's going to be a junior in college or a senior in college. Hit the pause button before you do your FAFSA for 2023-24 because a lot of these areas are going to be different, and you'll just want to pay attention to that. If you're the parent of a high school freshman right now, make sure you come back in a couple years and see what has changed. There are going to be some really substantial changes. Whether it impacts financial aid eligibility or not quite so sure, but these were changes just announced by the U.S. Department of Education in late December. And so we're still trying to understand what those changes are And then where they don't make a lot of sense, pushing back and saying, we think you got this wrong. And we'd like to have you make a technical adjustment so that it doesn't adversely impact students. One last thing is just if you do end up, after we finish up here, and say, oh, I had one other question, again, feel free to email me. After an event like this, I tend to get 1 or 2 emails, not a lot, and it's not at all overwhelming, and I'm happy to help coach you through this process if I can.
All right, Jeff, I just have a couple notes, 1 more minute, a couple reminders, everybody. On the Matamita High School Counseling website, there's a scholarship page, financial aid and scholarship page. Check it out, even if your son or daughter is not a senior this year, check it out because you'll see what kind of scholarships are available for the future. One of the things Jeff mentioned also was the college's website. You can find all kinds of scholarship information right on the college's financial aid website. And then last thing I know, I'd mentioned the MAVE scholarships. They are due on March 15th. So that's at mavgives.org. And the last thing, again, Jeff used this website a lot, the Office of Higher Education, ohe.state.mn.us. I find that a great resource for all kinds of financial aid information. With that, Jeff, thank you so much for presenting tonight. Patrick Crothers, thank you so much for getting this all set up. And to all of you who are here tonight, thanks so much for joining us. Have a great night.